Hello everyone. If this is the first video of mine you're coming across, welcome. For those returning, welcome back. Today we're going to examine two of the most significant historical challenges that one can raise against the Catholic doctrine of the papacy, and we're going to do so, I hope, with the utmost concern for maintaining intellectual honesty. If you've spent any considerable amount of time in conversations with Catholics, or if you've simply wondered why the Catholic Church makes the claims it does about the Pope, you've probably encountered these two historical controversies at one point or another. The first concerns a 7th century pope named Honorius, who was formally condemned as a heretic by an Ecumenical Council. The second concerns a period in the late 14th and early 15th centuries during which the Church had not one or two, but 3 simultaneous claimants to the throne of Peter, a 40-year crisis known as the Great Western Schism. Both of these episodes are historically well documented, neither is seriously disputed, and both, on the surface, appear to flatly contradict what the Catholic Church teaches about the papacy. That appearance of contradiction is worth taking seriously, because if the Catholic Church claims that the Pope is the supreme and infallible head of the universal Church, and if history shows us a Pope condemned as a heretic and a papacy dissolving into 3-way schism, then either the claims are wrong, or we're not reading the history as carefully as we should be. My argument today is that it is decisively the latter. These two crises, examined on their own terms and in their proper theological context, do not refute Catholic teaching about the papacy. In fact, they illuminate it, and in doing so, they raise questions that are worth sitting with, regardless of where you ultimately come down on the question of whether or not you should become Catholic. Now, before we can evaluate whether the history truly contradicts Catholic dogma, we need to understand what the dogma actually claims. This is where a great deal of confusion enters the conversation, because the Catholic claim about the papacy is frequently caricatured, and the caricature is, of course, much easier to refute than the real thing. The relevant document is the First Vatican Council Dogmatic Constitution, Pastor Aeternus, issued in 1870 during the reign of Pope Pius IX. It defines 2 dogmas that concern us here. The first, in Chapter 3, is that the Pope possesses supreme and immediate jurisdiction over the universal Church, and that his judgments are not subject to revision by any other authority. That's papal supremacy. The second, in Chapter 4, is the doctrine of papal infallibility, that when the Pope speaks ex cathedra, or from the seat, meaning seat of Peter, he possesses the infallibility with which Christ endowed his Church. These are strong claims, dogmatic to be exact, but notice already that the second claim contains a significant qualification. It does not say that the Pope is always right, or that everything he says carries divine protection, or that his personal holiness is guaranteed. It says that a specific, narrowly defined kind of formal pronouncement enjoys a specific kind of divine protection. What exactly that means and what conditions must be met for it to apply is the question we'll need to examine carefully. Now, in light of those 2 dogmas being properly defined and understood, we're going to examine 2 historical challenges. The 6th Ecumenical Council, meeting in Constantinople in the year 681, issued a formal condemnation of, quote, Honorius the heretic, and the subsequent pope, St. Pope Leo II, ratified the council's decision. Centuries later, the Church fractured into rival obediences for 40 years, with canonized saints supporting opposing claimants to the papacy. If you set these events against the claims of the First Vatican Council without any further analysis, the contradiction seems quite obvious. Our task is to determine whether it actually is. I've chosen to raise a prior question that shapes everything else, and I want to fully answer it before we get to the historical details. When we bring a historical episode and a doctrinal claim into conversation with one another, we're making choices about which one functions as our standard of judgment. Those choices are rarely made explicit in these types of discussions, but they do determine the outcome of the argument before it's properly begun. The most common approach in Protestant criticism of the papacy treats the historical record as the fixed and authoritative variable. The doctrine is treated as a claim, a hypothesis, something the Church merely asserts. When you find what looks like a clear counterexample in the historical record, the hypothesis is falsified. This is a recognizable method. It has the appeal of empiricism as well. Stick to the facts, let the evidence speak, and do not allow theological commitments to override what visibly happened. The Catholic approach, however, is structurally different. It does not begin by treating doctrine as a hypothesis to be tested. It begins from the prior conviction that Christ founded a church and made specific promises about its endurance, and it reads historical events in light of those promises. History, on this view, is the complex and often confusing record of human choices and failures, and its meaning is not always promised to be transparent on the surface. Now, neither of these starting points is obviously more rational than the other. The Protestant approach assumes that visible, documentable events are self-interpreting. The Catholic approach assumes that some truths are given in revelation and that they provide the interpretive framework for making sense of these events. Both are coherent positions, but they lead to very different conclusions about what the historical record of the papacy actually shows. And what I want to suggest is that the Catholic framework is not special pleading or motivated reasoning. Rather, it's the only framework adequate to all of the evidence, and the historical challenges we are examining today are actually much better explained within it than without it. So the single most important concept for understanding how Catholics interpret both of these crises is a distinction that runs through Catholic ecclesiology from its earliest formulations. The distinction between the seat of Peter, that is, the office of the papacy itself, and the Pope, the man who sits on the seat of Peter. In Catholic teaching, the divine promises made to the papacy, specifically the promises of indefectibility and infallibility, are attached to the office, not to the individual human being who occupies it. The rock on which Christ said the church would be built, whether you want to call it Christ himself, Peter's confession, Peter's faith, Peter, well, one interpretation is that the office of Peter is the rock on which Christ said the church would be built. The man who holds the office remains, in every other respect, a fallible human being. This is not a distinction invented by later theologians to rescue inconvenient historical facts. It's embedded in the New Testament account of the papacy's founding. Now, I understand many of those listening don't accept the Catholic conception of the papacy. That's perfectly understandable. But for the sake of argument, I'm just going to ask that you follow along, suspend your disbelief for merely a moment, and I promise it'll begin to make sense. All right, the first pope, Peter, denied knowing Christ 3 times on the night of the crucifixion. Years later, Paul publicly rebuked him at Antioch for refusing to eat with Gentile Christians, behavior Paul described as a direct threat to the integrity of the gospel. And yet, Christ had said to this same Peter, "I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail. And also, the gates of hell shall not prevail against the church built on his office." The promise was never about Peter's personal consistency or theological reliability. It was about the indestructibility of the institution entrusted to him. For many Protestants, this distinction will feel like a convenient escape hatch. They might even call it Catholic cope, a way of protecting the doctrine from any possible historical falsification. But consider what the alternative requires. If the Catholic claim were that the Pope is personally preserved from all significant error or moral failure, then yes, Peter's denial and Paul's rebuke would refute it immediately, before we even reach Honorius or the schism. The office-man distinction we established earlier is not an ad hoc defense mechanism. Rather, it's the doctrine stated clearly from the very beginning. Now, with that distinction in place, let's turn to the first historical case, Pope Honorius I. In the early 7th century, the Eastern Church was convulsed by a controversy known as monothelitism. The dispute was subtle but consequential. Orthodox Christian belief held that Christ possessed 2 complete natures, one divine and one human, each with its own natural operations and will. Monothelitism accepted the 2 natures but maintained that Christ had only a single will, a position its proponents believed would ease the reunion of divided Christian communities in the East. Patriarch Sergius of Constantinople, one of the architects of the monothelite formula, wrote to Pope Honorius in Rome seeking support. Honorius' response was, by almost any measure, a failure. He did not condemn the error. He did not clarify the orthodox position. Instead, he wrote back in language sufficiently ambiguous to give comfort to Sergius, and he urged all parties to stop debating the question altogether. Whatever his intentions, the practical effect was to allow a serious heresy to spread without the correction the Bishop of Rome should have provided as shepherd of the Church. Decades later, the Sixth Ecumenical Council met to settle the matter definitively. In its investigation of how monothelitism had gained such traction, it examined the private correspondence between Honorius and Sergius, and concluded that Honorius had, through his silence and negligence, given the heresy room to grow. The council then anathematized him, along with the principal promoters of the heresy. Pope St. Leo II, reviewing the council's acts, confirmed the condemnation. Now, to a Protestant observer, this looks like an open and shut case. Here's an ecumenical council and a canonized pope pronouncing an earlier pope a heretic. How can the Catholic Church claim, after this, that the papacy is either supreme or infallible? Well, the answer requires separating the two distinct dogmas we've already discussed, which this objection falsely treats as one. Take infallibility first, because this is where the most widespread misunderstanding lives. When most people hear papal infallibility, they imagine something like a continuous personal guarantee, a theological force field that protects the Pope from doctrinal error in everything he teaches, writes, or says 24/7, 365. Well, the Catholic Church has never taught this. The doctrine, as defined at the First Vatican Council, is a precisely bounded charism that applies only under a strict and demanding set of conditions, what we call a negative charism. For a papal statement to qualify as an ex cathedra definition, the following must all be true simultaneously. 1. The Pope must be speaking formally in his capacity as universal pastor of the whole Church, not as a private theologian, not in private correspondence, nor as a local bishop merely over Rome. 2. He must be addressing a matter of faith or morals. 3. He must demonstrate a clear intention to bind the entire universal Church to that definition as a matter of doctrine. Honorius' letters to Sergius satisfy none of these conditions. They were private correspondence addressed to a single patriarch in the East. They did not define doctrine. They offered a personal view on how to manage a controversy. They expressed no intention to bind the universal Church. In fact, Honorius' whole purpose of his letters was to prevent the matter from being publicly settled at all. What this means is that the doctrine of infallibility was never engaged in the case with Honorius. It simply does not apply. Honorius' failure was not a failure of the ex-cathedra charism, because the ex-cathedra charism was never invoked. What the case actually demonstrates is the very same office-man distinction we described earlier. The man was negligent. His private theological judgment was very poor, but the office protected the universal Church from having his error sanctioned as binding doctrine. Now, let's tackle supremacy. Chapter 3 of Pastor Aeternus states that the first see is judged by no one. However, the Sixth Ecumenical Council visibly issued a condemnation of a pope. Pope St. Leo II confirmed that condemnation. Now, the Protestant may ask, however you explain the infallibility question, does this not establish that the papacy can be held accountable by a council and by a successor pope, which is precisely what the supremacy doctrine denies? Now, this is a genuine objection, and it deserves a precise answer. The critical point is a canonical one that is easy to overlook. In Catholic ecclesiology, the decrees of an ecumenical council do not carry binding force until they've been reviewed, approved, and promulgated by the reigning pope. Before that papal act of reception, the council's decree is a formal finding, but not yet a final and authoritative judgment. It is, in legal terms, an indictment rather than a sentence. When the Sixth Ecumenical Council anathematized Honorius, it was referring its finding to the living pope for review. Pope St. Leo II examined the council's acts, evaluated the evidence, and then, in his own papal capacity, confirmed the condemnation. The authoritative judgment, canonically speaking, was Leo II's act, not the council's. The council merely made a recommendation. The pope made the binding determination. On this reading, the first see was not judged by an inferior or external authority. The see, in the person of its living occupant, passed judgment on a deceased predecessor. The authority remained within the Petrine office throughout the entire sequence of events. The dogma of supremacy remained intact. There is also one further detail in Leo II's own letters that deserves attention. When Leo confirmed the condemnation, he specified what he understood it to mean. He did not condemn Honorius for having taught heresy as a formal matter. He condemned him because Honorius, quote, did not extinguish the flame of heresy at its beginning, but fostered it by his negligence. The charge is pastoral dereliction, a personal failure of duty, not doctrinal defection or heresy. The man failed. The office, in his successor, acknowledged the failure, named it publicly, and corrected the record. The distinction between the seat of Peter and the man who sits on the seat could not be more plainly illustrated by the historical record itself. All right, let's move on to the Great Western Schism, because it presents a problem at a different register. Where Honorius required careful theological and canonical analysis, the schism confronts us with something more immediately striking. 4 whole decades of visible, undeniable structural chaos in the institution Catholics claim to be the divinely protected center of Christian unity. Here's what happened. In 1377, after approximately 70 years during which the papal court had been resident in Avignon under considerable French political influence, Pope Gregory XI returned to Rome. He died the following year. The conclave that met to choose his successor took place under intense pressure from the Roman populace, who feared the largely French College of Cardinals would elect another Frenchman and return to Avignon. Under the coercive atmosphere, the cardinals elected an Italian, Urban VI. Very quickly, Urban's volatile and abrasive conduct alienated the same cardinals who had chosen him. They withdrew, declared the election invalid on grounds of duress, and elected a second pope, Clement VII, who returned to Avignon. The division that followed mapped broadly onto existing political alignments. France, Scotland, and Aragon supported Avignon. England, the Holy Roman Empire, and most of the Italian peninsula remained with Rome. The division was not between the obviously devout and the obviously compromised, because St. Catherine of Siena, the Sienese mystic and later doctor of the Church, was one of the most outspoken defenders of the Roman obedience. St. Vincent Ferrer, a Dominican whose preaching across Spain and France drew enormous crowds, was firmly committed to Avignon. The confusion reached into the Church's very own most beloved saints. In 1409, a group of cardinals attempted to cut through the impasse by convening the Council of Pisa, which deposed both existing claimants and elected a third pope, Alexander V. Neither of the deposed claimants accepted the verdict. The result was not a resolution, but a 3-way division, with each party excommunicating the other 2. So, for a Protestant observer, this is the obvious question. If the Pope in Catholic teaching is the perpetual and visible source and foundation of unity, what do we make of 40 years in which the papacy was the most visible source of disunity in Western Christendom? Well, to answer that question honestly, we're going to need to be very precise about what kind of crisis the Great Western Schism actually was, because the category matters enormously. The schism was a juridical crisis. It was a dispute about succession and legitimacy, a deeply serious and profoundly damaging argument about which man held the rightful claim to the office of Peter. What it was not, at any point, was a doctrinal crisis. None of the rival claimants, in the course of competing for recognition and support, proposed a new or heterodox theology. No one offered a revised account of the Trinity, the Eucharist, the nature of the Church, or the papacy itself. The deposit of faith, as Catholics understood that phrase, was preserved throughout the entire crisis without alteration. Now, this distinction matters because it identifies precisely where the divine protection was and was not promised. The Church's claim has never been that the papacy would be administratively tidy or politically uncomplicated. The claim is that the faith would be preserved and that the office would endure. By those measures, the crisis, as catastrophic as it was in human terms, did not touch the substance of what the doctrine promises. Now, consider the further claim that there were 3 popes. From the perspective of ordinary believers trying to navigate the situation in real time, this was very nearly impossible to sort out. The epistemological difficulty was genuine, but in Catholic theology, there is a difference between what was epistemologically difficult to determine and what was ontologically true. Ontologically, there was never more than one legitimate successor of Peter. There was one true pope in the Roman line, and 2 anti-popes whose claims were, whatever their subjective sincerity, canonically defective. The fact that even saints could not reliably identify the legitimate claimant in real time does not dissolve the underlying ontological reality. The divine promise was not that contemporaries would always find it easy to identify the true pope. It was that the see itself would endure. Whether that endurance was always immediately visible to the people living through the crisis is a separate question entirely. There remains one final objection. The Council of Constance, which ended the schism in 1417, appears to have resolved the crisis by deposing all 3 claimants and electing a new pope. If that is what happened, then the council demonstrated in practice a supremacy over the papacy that flatly contradicts the Catholic doctrine. This is the argument from Constance, and it's also the argument that gave rise to the conciliarist movement, the view that a general council holds authority superior to the pope. But look at what actually happened at Constance, because the standard summary is not that accurate. The council's first 2 acts were not canonically controversial. It addressed John the 23rd, the Pisan claimant, a man whose election was of dubious legitimacy and whose conduct had been scandalous enough that even his supporters struggled to defend him. His removal posed no deep canonical problem. The council then turned to Benedict XIII, the Avignon claimant, who by this stage had been abandoned by virtually everyone and was refusing all compromise. His removal was similarly straightforward. The situation with Gregory XII, the Roman claimant, however, was entirely different. Gregory held one legitimate claim, and both he and the council knew it. The council had no canonical authority to depose him, because he was the true pope, and the council had not been convoked by him. Without his authorization, the council's acts were of questionable canonical standing, to say the least. What actually ended the schism was Gregory XII choosing to abdicate, freely and of his own initiative, for the sake of the Church's unity. But before he submitted his resignation, he issued a papal bull formally convoking and thereby legitimizing the Council of Constance. The council's canonical authority rested on his act. Having given the council its standing, he then abdicated and authorized it to proceed to elect his successor, Martin V. The crisis was resolved not by a council deposing the legitimate pope, but by the legitimate pope empowering the council and then stepping aside voluntarily. The papacy was never overruled. It was the final and necessary instrument through which the crisis was resolved. Far from demonstrating conciliarism, the events at Constance demonstrate the opposite, that without the authorizing act of the true pope, the council could not act with full canonical legitimacy. All right, let's summarize these arguments and pinpoint our takeaways. We began with 2 historical episodes that raised some very hard questions. The institutional church spent 40 years in a 3-way schism that divided saints and disrupted the spiritual lives of millions of ordinary Christians. There are serious historical challenges that deserve to be treated with respect. What we found, however, is that the challenges, when examined carefully, don't refute the Catholic claims they appear to refute. Honorius' failure was real, but it was a failure of the man, not of the office. The infallibility doctrine never applied to his private correspondence, and the subsequent condemnation was issued by his successor in the legitimate exercise of the papal authority. The schism was a genuine crisis of succession and legitimacy, but the faith was preserved throughout it, and the resolution at Constance was accomplished through, not over, the Petrine authority. So, what strikes me personally as worth reflecting on, regardless of your theological commitments, is the broader pattern these episodes reveal. The Catholic Church did not survive the 7th century or the 14th century because its leadership was consistently wise, virtuous, or reliable. By any human measure, the institutions should have fractured. The fact that the doctrinal content was preserved through negligent popes, through genuine saints backing the wrong claimant to the papal throne, through decades of jurisdictional chaos, is at a minimum a remarkable historical phenomenon. Catholics would say it's more than that. We would say it's precisely the kind of thing you would expect to see if the institution were being sustained by something other than human competence alone. Now, whether you find that persuasive is, of course, a question each person has to work through. But I hope this examination has at least demonstrated that the historical challenges, taken seriously and on their own terms, point in a more complicated direction than the simple refutation they're often assumed to provide. And with that, I'd like to thank you for watching. And if you like this type of content, I'd humbly ask that you like the video, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. And remember, Jesus loves you.